Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Mary Wood, Philip H. Knight Professor of Law and Faculty Director for the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Program at the University of Oregon School of Law. Wood teaches property law, natural resources law, public trust law, federal Indian law, public lands law, wildlife law, and hazardous waste law. She is the founding director of the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Program and is faculty leader of the program's Conservation Trust Project, Sustainable Land Use Project, and the Native Environmental Sovereignty Project. Wood is a frequent speaker on global warming issues and has received national and international attention for her sovereign trust approach to global climate policy. Her forthcoming book, published by Cambridge University Press, is titled Nature's Trust: Environmental Law for a New Ecological Age. Wood gave a panel presentation titled Micro Livestock and the Urban Homestead, Bringing Meat and Dairy to the Neighborhood, at the Wayne Morse Center's Food Justice Conference on February 21st, 2011. Mary, welcome to UO Today.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for taking the time to speak with us.
My pleasure.
You have a lot of speaking engagements at the moment, so I'm glad we managed to get you for a half hour. Mary, there are so many interesting things to talk about in your work, but I wanted to ask you to start with a very basic definition, which is how you would define environmental law.
Environmental law is a huge body of law. Most people think of statutes on the federal or state or even local level that seek to protect nature, natural resources, so wetlands, wildlife, soils, trees, etc., waters. It's also judge-made law and a group of common law principles that courts have developed to create protection for these natural resources. So it's very broad, and right now it is quite fractured. There are millions, perhaps, of pages of federal statutes and regulations and state statutes and regulations. It's become really overly complex and a little bit unmanageable these days.
I understand from the work of yours that I've read that one of the things we need to do is bring a more sort of global, comprehensive oversight over all of these different agencies through which environmental law is practiced, because otherwise we don't pull all those resources together for the ultimate goal. Is that a correct impression?
I think that's right. I think we're at a real juncture now where environmental law is becoming a bit irrelevant. We're seeing collapse of resources everywhere, from ocean acidification to climate crisis and species extinction. Biologists tell us we're at the threshold of the 6th major extinction on the planet. We have toxic water pollution that will never be remediated in our lifetimes. We've got cancer rates soaring through the roof, and we've even got genetic alteration through some of the toxins. So what has happened is industry has far surpassed the ability for environmental regulatory agencies to keep up with the activities. And we're reaching a point where it's threatening the planet. So environmental law is either going to become quickly irrelevant, or we've got to infuse it with some sort of deep purpose. And I always advocate that purpose as the public trust.
That's a really good place to ask you to define then what public trust is. I have to say that I was only in reading your work that I understood that notion. It's at the heart of the book that you're just finishing, right?
Right. My book is called Nature's Trust, and it elaborates on this ancient principle. It's a principle that we have found is universal to all governments, or almost all governments, perhaps not the totalitarian ones. But it's a principle that is embedded in popular sovereignty. It basically just means government, as the lasting institution that represents the public, is a trustee of resources for present and future generations. It must protect those resources for our future and for our present. And so it is very, very simple. A trust is a lasting sort of wealth that the people need. It comes in natural form through waters and air and climate and so forth, trees. And government is not at liberty to allow the destruction of that, because if it does, it will compromise the ability of our children to survive on this planet.
One of the things that surprised me, and it's just because I'm a newcomer to the vocabulary of this field, is the kind of juxtaposition or the overlay of legal terminology on what I've always thought of as a moral or ethical issue. So you talk about natural capitalism, generational theft, and there's this great quotation, part of which you just echoed, which is that the government is a trustee of natural resources with a fiduciary duty to protect such assets on behalf of the beneficiaries who are the citizens of today and tomorrow. So there's this amalgam of a heavily legal jargon on top of what to me looks like a moral issue.
Oh yes, I think the real power of the trust is that for the first time in 40 years, people can understand the thrust of this legal principle or a legal principle to protect natural resources. People have been left behind the environmental statutory framework. They don't really understand permitting conditions that go on for pages and pages and pages. They don't understand why listing the polar bear is any approach to climate crisis. But they do fundamentally understand that government is supposed to protect our resources against abuse and destruction so that we may survive, our children may survive, and our grandchildren and so forth. So it's a moral understanding that finds expression in the courts and in legal iterations. And that is the great power of it. It is a fusion of the moral realm and the legal realm. And as I say, the problem with environmental law today, one of the problems is it has left citizens behind. Agencies are trying to do good work, and there's good people in agencies, but the public can't understand what they're doing.
So you said that people are beginning to understand. What has shifted that people are beginning to get this?
Well, I think we are at a juncture in our planetary story where we really are the generation that will determine whether civilization goes on the way it has for the past couple hundred years or not. And our children, not our grandchildren anymore, our children within this century will suffer enormously brutal conditions if we don't take responsibility for climate, for oceans, for species, for soils. So it's not just climate crisis, it's a host of crises lining up. And I think when people start to understand, oh, this is up to us, it's not just up to the agencies anymore, it's up to us to take back control over some of these lethal practices that frankly, industry has perpetuated. Then they start searching for the moral grain within the law, and then they can use the law in a manner that's more productive, perhaps.
So you think that we're at that moment of trying to reconcile natural capitalism with capitalism as a purely economic system?
Well, that's an interesting question. I just wrote my chapter 13 of my book on that. We have pursued industrial capitalism as a model for a long time, and it has brought us enormous amounts of waste, pollution, and incredible environmental crises. And the problem is that the American model, which is very destructive of natural resources, has now been exported to every single country on the planet. So you've got mega corporations, multinationals, that literally are more powerful than some governments and certainly have more resources. And the world as a whole is threatened by this model because it just has no end. It's based on growth, it has no end. So I've been reading a lot about models of capitalism that are benign to the earth, and one is natural capitalism. In other words, it still supports the spirit of entrepreneurship that we know and love in America, but its major principle is that companies and communities should make their economic living in accordance with nature's requirements. And that means if you look at a trust account, imagine a college account that you're saving for your niece and your trustee. Well, you would be able to perhaps use the interest but not invade the capital until the day came when that needed to be done. So if you look at the nature's trust as a perpetual trust for all generations, industry should be using the interest and not invading the capital, not bringing species to extinction, not depleting soil so it won't grow food, not putting toxins in the water so that people are getting cancer. In other words, they should redesign their ways so that they use the interest. And that is what true sustainability is. And, you know, a couple of years ago, people might have said, well, that's just a pipe dream. But there is so much academic energy behind this right now. There are entire books being written on how industry can redesign itself to literally eliminate pollution and eliminate waste. There's a cradle-to-cradle movement, if you will, now in some sectors that looks at redesigning. So all of this is suddenly a feasible idea in many ways. Perhaps not always, but in many ways.
You sound genuinely optimistic that this is going to happen.
Well, I go between being terrified at the conditions of the world and yet being the voice of optimism, because I truly believe this is all very doable. We need citizens to wake up. We need parents to wake up more than anybody, because parents are far too engaged in the day-to-day pressures. They are not seeing the big picture. But many citizens are waking up and are realizing we've got to take some of the control back. We've got to hold our government accountable, and we've got to hold industry accountable. Is it doable? Absolutely. Our lives are based so much on waste and excess. There's a lot of room to change. Can we do it? Can we start today, which we really must? We can't let it go another even year or two if you look at the numbers. That is where I'm terrified at the complacency of the population, and yet I meet people every day that have decided they're going to make some change. And that is profound, because they impact others and inspire others to do that.
You finished chapter 13 of the book.
Yes.
There's not much more of it
Not
to
much
go,
more.
right? What's left to write?
I have a chapter on property, use of property and property law. That's chapter 14. And then 15 will wrap it up. Then I'll go back over the whole thing and do some rewriting, surely.
I know it's coming out with Cambridge. Will we see it out this year still, in the calendar year? Or?
I would hope so. I think so. I really think so. 2011.
Good for you. It's going to be a landmark book.
Thank you.
Well done. I know you do a great deal of public speaking. Mm-hmm. You're in the newspaper all the time and all sorts of forms of the media. How does that fit with the academic piece of your research?
It is so energizing to do two things. First, to take my thinking and research out to the world, and to start putting these ideas out there so that we're not just lodged up in the academic ivory tower. I really believe a law school has a duty of public service to educate more than just the people in those halls. And then, of course, it's a two-way street. I am exposed to so much. I get so many ideas from audiences that I speak to. Maybe a question will address something I hadn't thought of, and it just lodges in my mind and kind of bothers me for a couple weeks, and then I decide to just take it on. And that can turn me in a direction that opens up all sorts of research avenues. So I believe this is a fundamental part of university life and service.
You mentioned earlier when we were talking before we began the interview that you also see it as a piece of your larger educational mission. Mm-hmm. Did I get that correct?
Oh, absolutely. We send students out to the community. We attract students from the community. We're always looking for community projects so that our students can have real-world application of the legal principles they learn in class. So it's more of a membrane, not really a wall around the law school, and we cross that membrane to the community all the time, and that's what makes life so rich, I think, in that regard.
That's a wonderful metaphor. I think there's a membrane around the Humanities Center, too,
yes,
and with
exactly.
interviews like this one, we're trying to reach out through it. Yeah. Mary, for the Food Justice Conference here on the UO campus in February, the topic of your presentation has to do with urban homesteading. It's a wonderful phrase, urban homesteading. It's immediately evocative of those chickens in everyone's backyard. Right. Could you explain the principle behind it?
Yes, urban homesteading is one of the most exciting and fun new areas I've studied. I come at this area from property law, from teaching property law. It's basically a movement countrywide, and even in other countries as well, but certainly all across the United States, where people in suburbia and apartments and urban places are trying to move towards self-sufficiency to varying degrees, and they are either producing their own food on site, or perhaps they're buying locally directly from farmers and doing canning and drying of fruit and freezing of vegetables. They're putting up their own food supply, and they're doing as much as they can themselves, but they're also creating new markets, which is very exciting for natural capitalism. They're creating new local markets so that farmers can sell directly to local customers. So urban homesteading is evident everywhere across Eugene now. It's evident in the school gardens, in the church gardens, in the chickens, backyard chickens. People are baking bread, people are canning. They're making their own soup, they're cooking at home, which is something we've got to return to, really. They're doing all of these things that perhaps our predecessors 50 years ago did. And it's making a big difference on the local level. And I think it can in local areas nationwide and even worldwide.
You use the term relocalization, which I spent about 30 seconds figuring out. It is not relocating something, it is making it local again, correct?
Exactly.
The production of food, the preparation of food, the marketing of food.
Right. We in the 80s and 90s, and then when we crossed the millennium, we expanded ever more to these markets across the globe, so that now the average consumer is just a tiny anonymous point in this network that goes everywhere across the globe. Food usually comes 1,300 miles to the dinner plate. So you might be cooking a meal and have your garlic from China. You might have, something from South America and something even from Africa. So the relocalization movement is a different approach to food. It's eat what grows near you, try to grow as much yourself, and try to support your local farmers. It's a marvelously freedom-building movement in the citizens because it creates self-sufficiency in a population, creates food security, and it's a wonderful way for us to, just reclaim a little space from the industrial food system that has taken over the world and which has become quite dangerous in some ways.
Now, thinking about my own neighborhood in Eugene, there are a lot of thriving gardens and a lot of people are producing a lot of great produce. But there is also, I think, a certain built-in resistance in more urban neighborhoods to the notion of raising animals in the backyard. So what is actually a manageable urban practice that still respects the privacy and the quiet and the silence of the neighbor who doesn't want to raise her own chickens, for example?
Yes, and that's really the line we have to find and walk very carefully. Our environmental program did a project, a micro-livestock white paper, and we looked at micro-livestock ordinances all around the country. And by micro-livestock, we're talking about chickens or rabbits or ducks or geese, whatever, goats. And we found that the land use laws are changing because people want to have some measure of self-sufficiency. Many people, not all. They want to be able to raise their own food. Sometimes that means meat, sometimes it's eggs, sometimes it's dairy. And so the suburban lifestyle has been really supported by a set of regulations that are more geared towards a perfection that no longer reigns today. It's the perfect lawn, the perfect barbecue set, the McMansion, and so forth. It's a very oil-dependent and wasteful way of life, and many people are still living it, but it is crumbling because of oil prices and because of food security problems that are probably on the horizon. So the point with this is that the law has to reform somewhat to find that balance between the issues of quiet enjoyment of property and self-sufficiency. And the students I worked with and the team believes that line really can be drawn, that homeowners can engage in micro-livestock use with a few chickens, even a goat and things like that, without having any sort of impact on the neighbors. Many of the land use laws that we're acquainted with which prohibit those kinds of activities were really based on the big farm model, preventing the nuisances from big farms. They really didn't take into account good management practices on a very small scale.
One of the potential objections, or not an objection really, but perhaps a flaw in the thinking, is that it may be more privileged households that are more prepared to engage in urban homesteading, and that the urban poor, whom we want to help find access to good food stores, maybe aren't in a position to do it themselves. What would you answer to that?
Well, I think actually some of the most promising and exciting models are in inner city areas, in Detroit, in Oakland, and places like that. When you find, there's new authors are writing about this all the time, that when you start growing gardens on some of these vacant lots, of which there are many in these inner city areas, the garden itself attracts people, it provides food security, but it also builds a sort of community, even in crime-ridden areas. And there are some phenomenal heroes out there that are building up these inner city gardens. And so I think we'll have to wait and see, but I think this offers a new ray of hope from out of the blue for some areas that we would think of as perhaps not naturally gravitating towards this because of the lack of lawns. Doesn't necessarily take lawns to create an urban homestead. A vacant lot will do.
Akin in some ways to what we know from another area as a victory garden, maybe.
Exactly. The victory garden is a wonderful model because in World War II, 40% of the food supply was produced in backyards, 40%. And so there's a big victory garden movement here in Eugene, but also in cities across the country now, because it's not just some sort of hobby we're pursuing, it is actually a need to relocalize, because we can't keep up this long-distance transportation system because it uses far too much carbon. And if we want to get a handle on carbon pollution, we absolutely have to tackle it from the food perspective.
I'm curious to know where you would put Eugene on the spectrum of small or even larger urban communities that are moving towards the urban homesteading movement. A friend of mine jokes about what he calls rural sprawl, turning front and backyard into rabbit hutches and pumpkin patches and vineyards, micro vineyards. Is Eugene embracing this faster than elsewhere in the country?
I don't know. We'd like to think so, perhaps, because that's I certainly observe a lot of energy here in Eugene. But Portland is doing it, Seattle is doing it, and I must say from the legal perspective, there are cities that are far ahead of Eugene in revising their ordinances to allow a more diverse array of micro livestock and this kind of activity. Seattle is probably the leader. Eugene is a bit behind, but they are in the process of revising their ordinances. So most of the leading ordinances on micro livestock are actually much more flexible than Eugene's. But again, Eugene is in the process of revising theirs.
You describe in some of your writing the history of urban land use laws, and you point out that for a long time we've held on to the desire to make a really clear, clean distinction between what is rural and what is urban, and that must go with a whole set of values. So are we making a cultural change about what counts as rural and what counts as urban?
I think there's still going to be these rural areas, but I must say there's you might even think of it as a freedom movement growing within the urban boundaries that attracts a whole lot of different people from different political stripes. And it's more of a yearning for self-sufficiency. So if you go out to farmland areas, you find the people living out there are very self-sufficient. They know how to raise their own food. They care deeply about it. They don't want to be dependent on other food sources. You're starting to find that rural mentality cropping up within the suburban boundaries. And that is where it bumps into the suburban lifestyle, which is oriented more towards perfection, manicured living, the big car, the two-car garage, the showcase home. It's a very different set of values.
I'm curious whether I know one can do this well. I'm curious if one can do it badly. And I'm also, are there noxious effects? Are there nuisance effects of doing it badly? I'm sure there are. But I'm also curious, that leads me to the real question, which is, how do people learn how to do this?
Okay, well, to answer your question, there's a lot of urban homesteaders in Eugene, and I think they share information on themselves, and that's a wonderful community building sort of endeavor. Could you do it badly? I suppose human beings can do just about anything very badly. I have not, in my research, found in these cities that have loosened their ordinances, I've not found, in talking to their staff people, complaints of noxious odors or noxious noises or anything like that. They're quite surprised. Things seem to be going pretty well. So, not to say they always will, but I think we tend to overblow, perhaps, the potential for noxious effects on neighbors. How do you learn it? There are so many books out now. The Urban Homestead, the Backyard Homestead, Farm City, Food Not Lawns, and there's probably about 10 others I could mention. Animal Vegetable Miracle. These are all, and a couple of other books are some of my favorites. Plentitude is a good one, but Plentitude talks about a new economy that is based on self-provisioning in part. And Juliet Shore just wrote it. It's a new book, Plenitude. I think it's wonderful. And then Depletion and Abundance for more family perspective in approaching urban homesteading. That book is written by Sharon Astick. So those two books I really recommend.
Is there an urban homesteading for dummies yet?
There's beekeeping for dummies.
So it won't be long.
It's not hard. People just take one thing at a time.
I noticed there is a website, in fact, called urbanhomestead.org that has 10 elements of urban homesteading that in a list of 10. You've got all the principles right there.
It's so easy, but everything's a project. You learn how to make bread, you learn how to can food, you learn how to raise chickens, you maybe learn how to raise bees. It's a continuum. And the wonderful thing about this is there's a keeping up with the Joneses dynamic. Once people, and I speak a little bit personally here, once people get into this urban homesteading track, which I have too, you want to do more and more and more. And so that's kind of a fun element. Rather than going out and buying the barbecue and the nice car, you want to do more of your own self-sufficient activities.
That's tantalizing because I want to ask you what you're doing, but in fact we're out of time, so I'm going to have to stop you there. This was a great conversation.
Thank you.
I learned a lot reading your work and listening to you. Thank you so much. Our guest today has been Mary Wood, Philip K. Knight Professor of Law and Faculty Director for the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Program. Her forthcoming book is titled Nature's Trust, Environmental Law for a New Ecological Age. Wood gave a panel presentation titled Micro-Livestock in the Urban Homestead, Bringing Meat and Dairy to the Neighborhood at the Wayne Moore Center's Food Justice Conference on February 21st, 2011. Thank you for watching.